Good morning.
Good morning.
Nice to see everyone. Seems that you survived the ice. Cool. It's nice to get a little bit of good, proper cold, so that when we get into the warming up, that we can appreciate it a little bit more. But I always love in Eugene how it doesn't take much to shut everything down. And I'm quite fond of shutting everything down. Sometimes I wish there was just a switch. Could just turn it off every once in a while. Remember those first few days of COVID? It was a relief, kind of. You know, it was scary, but there was also this little like, oh, we can stop doing things. But then if you had kids, you couldn't really stop doing things, so that was also difficult. Everyone had different experiences. So this morning we'll have the very important ceremony of Parinirvana. Parinirvana means something like perfect nirvana, and it's the way that we commemorate the passing of the Buddha Shakyamuni from this world. The classical understanding is that when the Buddha woke up underneath the Bodhi tree, that the Buddha attained nirvana. And we'll become familiar with that word, nirvana. It means something like extinguished, which doesn't have such a positive connotation in English typically, but it means that all of the karma, all of the compelling cyclical energy behind that particular life had been come to full completion. And in the full completion could drop away. So that happened when the Buddha was awakened under the Bodhi tree, almost completely. But it's called nirvana with remainder. The remainder being there's no more karma being created, but there is still part of the karmic cycle which is being played out. And upon the dissolution of the Buddha's physical and mental body, then this complete nirvana could be attained. So this is a kind of classical understanding of what parinirvana is about. So we don't usually say the death of the Buddha. Right? Although it also means the death of the Buddha. But we don't say the death of the Buddha because the Buddha, in an essential way, never dies. That the awakening of a Buddha doesn't come or go. It simply is the fact of being. This is a kind of underlying teaching, particularly of the Mahayana. And in the Lotus Sutra, which we're studying now during this practice term, there are some important stories about that. And during our ceremony here in a little bit, we'll read one of those sutras, or one of the chapters from the Lotus Sutra, which is called A Verse of the Lifespan. And last week in my Dharma talk, I was talking a bit about this story. This is a story that Shakyamuni Buddha tells. It's very short, but he tells this story about what is the nature of his coming and going. That actually the Buddha never comes and goes, but there is a reason for the Buddha appearing and disappearing, or a Buddha being born into the world and a Buddha dying and leaving the world. That actually is for the purpose of all beings being able to wake up. That it's what, in the language of the Lotus Sutra, it's a skillful means. It's a way that the Buddha acts to help everyone be able to wake up to their own Buddhahood. And so he tells this story, he says, or it's a metaphor, a parable. He says, suppose there was a man, a wise man, and he had many children. And while he was away on a trip somewhere, his children had got into his things. Children never do that. And they had taken some of a kind of medicine that he had. But to them it was poisonous. And so they all became afflicted with this, with the effects of this poison. And when he returns, he sees that they're all very, very sick. And so he goes, oh, okay, those of you who are dads or moms, I'm sure you experience this. You're like, okay, we got to do something about this. And so he puts together a medicine, and he gives this medicine to his children. And some of them take it right away, and they're cured. Some of them are very hesitant about it. Maybe they'll take a little, and some just refuse to take it. They don't even really quite realize that they're sick. And so this man, he goes on another trip. He leaves the medicine, he goes on another trip, and then he sends back word to his children that he has died. And in their sorrow, the ones who would not take the medicine, take the medicine, and they're cured. So this is a story that Shakyamuni Buddha is telling to talk about what are the expedient means or skillful means of his appearing and disappearing. We're just like those children. We're in this world in which there shouldn't be any trouble at all. There's no reason for us to be sick. But somehow, in ingesting this world, we are creating a lot of problems. And we get very attached to some things and very averse to other things, and we create this whole disease or dis-ease. And that the Buddha is offering us medicine, but as long as we're there, as long as the Buddha's there, we're a little bit too comfortable. We're like, see, the Buddha's awake, and I can bow to the Buddha, and I can adore the Buddha, and I can have reverence for the Buddha, but the Buddha always kind of stays out there. The cure is always kind of over there. And so when the Buddha disappears, oh, what am I going to do? I can't just think about things being okay as something over there, something later on, something not me. I have to wake up to my own nature, to my own awakening. And that this is in fact the reason that the Buddhas come in and out of the world. This is what Shakyamuni Buddha explains. At first it's quite counterintuitive. Like, wouldn't it be better if there was just the Buddha there? You could go ask some questions, You could be inspired. And that part's important. We do need to see the Buddha as a separate thing, something we can be inspired by. But then we have to go the next step into making the Buddha's life our own life. And then our image of the Buddha, our idea of the Buddha, all in some ways can become a hindrance. So this is why this parinirvana, the total nirvana of the Buddha, in which his physical and mental form disappears, is very important for us. In a way, is a kind of a challenge. The Buddha's like, look, I left the medicine. You want to take it? So there was another story that I was bringing up in the Dharma talk last week, and this was a story that Manjushri is telling to Maitreya Buddha. Don't worry if you don't know who those people are too much. But it's a very curious story. This is a story that's about the ancient past. And when you say ancient past in Lotus Sutra terminology, that means like many big bangs ago. Okay, not like 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, like in a galaxy far, far away, right? In the time we can't really put a finger on in any way, kind of beyond our sense of time. And Manjushri says there was a Buddha named Sunlight and Moonlight Buddha. And this Sunlight and Moonlight Buddha, primordial Buddha, maybe we could say, existed in the world, taught the Dharma, passed away, and the next Buddha that came into that world was also known as Sunlight and Moonlight Buddha, and that this happened in succession for 20,000 Buddhas. And after those 20,000 Buddhas, the very last of those Sunlight and Moonlight Buddhas is preaching the Dharma. And then he says this very interesting thing to one of his students named Wondrous Light Bodhisattva. He says, "You are the eye of the world." This is a complex story that's very hard to follow. I'm not going to go through the whole story, but I'm just talking about that one part. The Sunlight and Moonlight Buddha He's preaching the Dharma, and then he turns to the Bodhisattva wondrous light. Wondrous is an interesting word. In the Chinese, it means, sometimes we could say something like ungraspable. It's not just fantastic. It can mean fantastic. It can mean, like was that one Charlie and Chocolate Factory kind of fantastic? It can be like that. But it also means something like completely ungraspable, beyond our ability to hold in our mind or even in our heart. So this wondrous light, Bodhisattva, the Buddha, sunlight and moonlight, says, you are the eyes of the world. And the reason I was emphasizing that is this is what the Buddha is trying to teach by coming and going. If the Buddha is kind of eternally appearing in the world, we won't reform our own way of seeing the world. We just see the Buddha and we think the Buddha is a person or a thing or even just a teaching. But what the Buddha is encouraging us to do as bodhisattvas and recognizing our career as a bodhisattva is that our fundamental job is to reform our eye, to reform the way that we see, the way we're experiencing, the way we regard. Really, to be able to see the Buddhahood of all beings becomes the work of the bodhisattva, not just to see the Buddhahood of that great Buddha Shakyamuni. But actually our job is to see Buddhahood in all things. That's how the Buddha sees. The Buddha sees the world not as a problem. The Buddha sees the world as a land of awakening. And so the Buddha, by seeing us as Buddhas, allows us to be bodhisattvas. And then we can work on the way we're thinking about the world, the way that we're viewing the world, the way that we regard the world. And as we do that, then practice of the Buddha way can unfold. It's not just that we work really, really hard to get to the place where we understand. We can start with this understanding that the Buddha is offering us. We can start with saying, I have some poison I've taken, right? So I'm not seeing things clearly. To see things clearly, there's a medicine. And the first part, the medicine that the Buddha is giving us is regard things with care. Care for them like they are me. If I'm here, you will think it's about caring for me. And when I disappear, now you have to start seeing that it's about caring for everything as my body. And that the Buddha's body is really ungraspable. So there, in this story of the sunlight and moonlight, Buddha's one thing that I really appreciate about this story is it's emphasizing this continual birthing of Buddhas. There's 20,000 of these sunlight and moonlight Buddhas. I can't help but smile every time I say that or think about it. 20,000. Just think how many cycles of sunlight and moonlight Buddha have you been present for? It's every moment, every day, the sun and the moon, all of this consciousness, all of this illumination is this continual birthing of an awakening. Now, in a classical Buddhism, birth and death are seen almost only as a problem. They're seen as the kind of problem of cyclical existence, of things come into existence and then they reach their lifespan and they go out of existence, and that causes more suffering, right? Because we're grasping onto those things and we lose them. And that's important for us to see, that our own clinging leads to a kind of suffering and a misunderstanding about why things are important. They're not important because we can own them and keep them the same, right? We know this again, talking a lot about parents today. I think because my mother-in-law arrived from Japan on Thursday, and that it's such a blessing to be in the presence of, I get to be in the presence of 4 generations of women in my family, from my granddaughter to my mother-in-law. It's really special, and this kind of birthing that's happening. But anyway, back to being a parent. as a parent, you get it. Like, you don't want to own your children. You don't want to keep them the same. I mean, there's certain parts you want them to keep saying that thing in the funny way they do when they're 3 because it's so cute. But you know that if they're like 12 and they say it that way, it's not going to be good for them or anyone else. So you know that there's certain parts you're sorry to see go, but really you know that their maturation is important and everything and that they're changing because they're alive. Because as a parent, you don't regard them as an object of your possession. You know that they are a living being. But actually, we should have that attitude towards everything. That everything is living, and it's living in that kind of way. It can't be my possession. It's something which will come into existence. It will have a span of material, mental, emotional life, and that will also drop away. And that is not... Our grasping onto it makes it painful. But here in the Lotus Sutra kind of teaching, birth and death now changes a bit. It's not simply a kind of story of the problem of the disease that we have, that we need this medicine for, but birth and death also becomes the story of the one great matter in Lotus Sutra words. Okay? It becomes the story of what is the most important thing about this freedom that the Buddha discovered. And that one most important thing is that the Buddhas arrive in the world to respond to the suffering of beings, to respond to the delusion, to respond to the dis-ease. And they're encouraging us to do the same thing. We won't get away from the disease or the dis-ease by trying to destroy it, because in trying to destroy it, we'll destroy the body of the Buddha that's there. We'll actually have to start treating it in another way. It's not so complicated, but it's not easy to do, right? To start caring for things in another way. You can't think your way into it, right? You can't even try your way into it, really. It's good to try. But the real shift is something which is just a shift. Just reform the way that you pay attention to it. And this is what we're studying all the time at the temple. I know several of you came for the first time today for meditation instruction. And we'll always, when we're advertising that, we have a little bit of a conundrum because meditation has become a very common, popular thing. A lot of people want to learn meditation, and that's great. And the meditation that we teach, in some ways, maybe not fair to say is meditation. In some way it is, of course, is meditation, but it's also going to bring you back to these essential questions about life and death. So maybe you bite off a little bit more than you bargained for if you walk in that door. You thought, I was going to learn to calm my mind. Yeah. But the reason that we still call it meditation practice is if you calm your mind a little bit, or if you just sit with your mind, even if it's not calm, the story of birth and death will come to you pretty quickly, right? That the things that you're deeply concerned about, that are animating your own life and your own dis-ease, are those questions of birth and death. They don't always appear as so starkly an issue of birth or death, but eventually you'll start to see them in that way, and your life undoubtedly will deal you some experience with the literal birth and death. So the reason that we function that way, the reason we teach it that way, is because really meditation is about this essential thing which the Buddha is presenting here, about his own death or his own parinirvana. That this coming and going is not really a problem. In fact, it's the deep opportunity of a life, particularly of a human life, to care for the coming and going in that way, not just the coming. Birth is not just a celebration, and death is not just a tragedy. But actually, these two are always in total support of each other. And we usually have a party when a baby is born, and we have a funeral when someone dies. It is solemn. Actually, the loss or the absence of, shows us a spaciousness in our heart, which can be difficult to look at. And if you've lost someone that's important to you, you'll know that. It's very hard to look at that space and to be able to honor it, because now it feels like a whole, right? So we take care of that when we commemorate the Buddha's passing. Someday we will have a traditional Parinirvana scroll, and you can look at that and you will get this very beautiful teaching. The Buddha is sitting, laying down in the center between two important trees, two sal trees, and he's looking forward. And then in the Parinirvana scrolls that are most favored in Japanese Buddhism, the Buddha is surrounded by all manner of beings. You know, his close disciples are close. Some are like sort of trying to tear their ears off because they don't have any hair because they're monks. And they're totally distraught. And some are just completely serene. And there's all manner of animals and demons and heavenly beings that are coming. There's this whole, it's a kind of mandala, but not so kind of like a straight line as a typical mandala of all beings. You know, in the Lotus Sutra, when it talks about all of the beings of the assembly, 84,000 beings, they're all there, and the Buddha's totally quiet there, lying in the middle, you know, just as he's passing into nirvana. That space there that was the Buddha's body, that's the I that he's offering to us. It's not just to see his body, it's to see through what his body was. And if we practice that, we're just practicing to see Buddha everywhere, not just to stop on that physical form of the Buddha, but to see through that Buddha to the grasses and the trees and the VW buses or whatever it may be. So for our ceremony, which will get started here in a couple minutes, I'll leave the hall to change my robe, and then when we return, there will be an incense offering, some incense words, and then formal offerings of tea and sweet water and sweets to the Buddha. And then after I return back to this place, then the whole assembly will come forward and offer chip incense in silence. This is probably the only ceremony in which we're doing a ceremony and there's silence for such a long period of time. That's by design. That's this kind of absence, which is also a kind of fullness. And then after that, we make 9 prostrations, but we do that with the chant leader, Daoren, will intone the name of Shakyamuni Buddha, and then we will say it back. And then with each time, then she'll ring a bell and we'll make a bow. If you can make a prostration, you make a prostration. If it's just a standing bow is better for you, standing bow is okay. So we're doing 9 prostrations. Normally we would do 3, but the 9 are timed together with a bell, etc. And then there'll be a chanting of the verse of the lifespan, which there's copies of will be passed out, and then dedication of merit. And then after that, we'll have time to visit, etc. Did I leave anything out? Was that the whole ceremony down there?
Yeah.
I'm supposed to know, but I don't always. Very good.